There's nothing quite like the ache of choosing loneliness over the risk of being truly seen. Sometimes we build walls so high that even love cannot climb them, convinced that solitude is safer than the vulnerability of connection. In the frozen village of Frostgard, Stigvard the Giant had done exactly that. Standing 7 feet tall, he lived alone at the village edge, turning away every maiden who sought his hand. The finest daughters of neighboring clans had offered themselves in marriage, yet none could reach his guarded heart. One bitter winter morning, as Stigvard sat outside his longhouse, watching frost paint the world white, an old widow named Gudrun stopped before him. With eyes that had witnessed decades of village life, she spoke words that cut through his defenses. "Come inside, or die alone in the cold." What could this weathered old woman offer that young beauties could not? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Frostgard had known many harsh winters, but none quite like the one that brought Gudrun face to face with the giant on that crystalline morning. Snow fell in thick curtains beyond the warmth of hearth fires, and the wind carried stories of distant lands across the frozen fjords. In this remote corner of the Norse world, where survival demanded both strength and wisdom, every soul had learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death. Stigvard Ironhand, though few dared speak his name aloud, had carved his reputation from the very granite of the northern mountains. At 7 feet and 3 inches, with shoulders broad enough to bear the weight of fallen trees, he moved through the world like a force of nature itself. His hands, scarred from countless battles and seasons of hard labor, could split oak with a single blow or craft the most delicate woodwork when solitude demanded gentle occupation. The longhouse he had built stood as testament to both his skill and his isolation, a masterwork of timber and stone that could shelter a dozen families, yet housed only one man and his carefully guarded memories. The villagers of Frostgard had long since stopped trying to understand their giant neighbor. Children would dare each other to run past his dwelling, their small feet crunching through snow as they glimpsed the massive figure seated on his stone throne, a chair he had hewn from a single boulder, positioned precisely where the morning sun would touch it first each day. The mothers would call their little ones back with gentle scolding, but their eyes would linger on Stigvard's solitary form, wondering what manner of pain could drive such a man to choose emptiness over companionship. The stone throne itself told a story to those wise enough to read its carved surfaces. Ancient runes spiraled along its armrests, speaking of journeys undertaken and prices paid. The seat bore the smooth impression of countless hours of contemplation, worn smooth by the weight of a man who found peace only in his own company. On the back rest, barely visible unless one knew where to look, Stigvard had etched a single symbol, a tree with roots that ran deeper than its branches reached high. Those who understood the old ways recognized it as the mark of one who had lost his place in the world and sought to grow new roots in foreign soil. 3 winters had passed since Sigrid the Fair, daughter of Jarl Magnus, had made her offer of marriage. She had come dressed in her finest blue wool, accompanied by her father's most trusted advisers, bearing gifts of silver arm rings and promises of political alliance. Stigvard had received them with the courtesy due to honored guests, offering mead and roasted meat, listening to their carefully rehearsed speeches about the benefits of joining their houses. When Sigrid herself had finally spoken, her voice carrying the musical quality that had won the hearts of a dozen suitors, Stigvard had looked into her bright eyes and seen only the reflection of his own emptiness. "Your offer honors me," he had said, his deep voice carrying no warmth despite the politeness of his words. "But I am not the man you seek." Sigrid had pressed, as was her right. "You know nothing of what I seek, Stigvard Ironhand. Perhaps I see something in you that others have missed." The giant had stood then, his massive frame casting shadows across the fire-lit hall. "What you see is a man who has forgotten how to be anything but alone. A husband requires a heart, and mine was buried long ago in southern lands." The rejection had rippled through the surrounding villages like stones thrown into still water. If Stigvard would not accept Sigrid the Fair, whom would he accept? Other offers had followed. Astrid the Wise, whose knowledge of herb lore was legendary. Thora the Bold, who could handle a sword as skillfully as any warrior. Ingrid the Gentle, whose kindness had brought comfort to countless grieving families. Each had been received with the same courteous refusal until the visits stopped coming altogether. The men of Frostgard spoke of Stigvard with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. His skill in battle was unquestioned. Raiders had learned to avoid the coastal approaches near his dwelling after he had single-handedly driven off a crew of 20 Danish Vikings who had attempted to winter in the protected bay below his headland. Yet for all his prowess with axe and sword, he showed no interest in the raiding expeditions that brought glory and silver to other warriors his age. Instead, he tended his small plot of hardy crops, maintained his solitary household, and carved intricate wooden figures that he would sometimes leave at the doors of village families, particularly those with young children. The carved figures themselves were marvels, tiny warriors and shield maidens, wolves and ravens, dragons curled in protective circles around smooth stones that represented dragon eggs. Each piece showed a level of artistry that spoke of countless quiet hours spent in contemplation, the giant's massive fingers somehow finding the precision needed to bring life to dead wood. Children would treasure these gifts, though few had ever seen the giant actually delivering them. He moved like morning mist, present at dawn and gone when the household stirred to full wakefulness. Gudrun, widow of Jarl Eriksson, understood solitude in ways that younger souls could not fathom. She had buried her husband 15 winters past, had raised 3 sons who now sailed distant seas on trading expeditions, and had learned that loneliness and being alone were entirely different creatures. At 62, with silver hair that caught light like spun moonbeams and eyes the color of winter sky, she had become the unofficial keeper of village wisdom. Young wives sought her counsel on matters of heart and hearth, and even the current Jarl would sometimes call upon her when particularly thorny disputes required the perspective that only long life could provide. Her cottage stood at the heart of Frostgard, its walls thick with river stones and its roof heavy with grass that stayed green even under snow. Inside, bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with the scents of summer preserved against winter's assault. Her loom occupied one corner, where she wove wool dyed with berries and bark into patterns that told stories, family histories, seasonal celebrations, and sometimes darker tales of hard choices and necessary sacrifices. On the morning when fate would finally intervene in Stigvard's self-imposed exile, Gudrun had risen before dawn to check on the village's oldest resident, Magnus the Ancient, whose cough had worsened with the deepening cold. She carried a leather satchel filled with honey-sweetened herb preparations and mare's milk cheese wrapped in clean linen. The path to Magnus's dwelling led directly past Stigvard's headland, and as she rounded the bend where wind-swept pines gave way to open ground, she saw the giant seated on his stone throne as he did every morning, regardless of weather. But something was different this day. Where usually Stigvard sat with the alert stillness of a man comfortable in his own company, this morning he seemed diminished somehow, as though the weight of winter had finally found a way past his defences. His great shoulders curved inward, and his breath rose in steady clouds that spoke of deep, weary sighs, rather than the purposeful breathing of a man at peace. Gudrun had lived long enough to recognize the signs. She had seen them in her husband during his final summer, when the knowledge of approaching death had settled over him like an invisible cloak. She had observed them in her middle son, when his young wife died, birthing their first child, and in countless others who had reached the highest end of their ability to carry their burdens alone. It was the posture of a soul preparing to surrender, and Gudrun knew, with the certainty that comes with decades of watching human hearts break and heal, that Stigvard Ironhand was closer to the edge than anyone realized. The wind picked up as she approached, sending snow devils spinning across the cleared ground before his longhouse. Stigvard did not acknowledge her presence, though she knew his warrior's instincts would have marked her approach long before she came within speaking distance. His eyes remained fixed on the distant mountains, where morning light was just beginning to touch the highest peaks with fingers of rose and gold. Gudrun stopped 3 paces away, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to respect the invisible boundaries that solitary souls drew around themselves. She studied his profile, noting the new lines that winter had etched around his eyes, the way his massive hands lay too still upon the carved armrests of his throne. In that moment, she made a decision that would alter both their lives in ways neither could foresee. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of age and the compassion of one who had learned that sometimes kindness required courage. Come inside, or die alone in the cold. Stigvard's head turned slowly, as if awakening from a deep dream. His pale blue eyes, the color of ice over deep water, fixed on Gudrun with an expression that held equal parts surprise and wariness. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the ash tree that grew beside his dwelling. "Old woman," he said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder, "your words are bold for one who stands uninvited on another's ground." Gudrun's weathered face remained unmoved by the gentle rebuke. She had not lived 6 decades by retreating from uncomfortable truths, and she would not begin now. Bold words for bold times, giant. I've watched you sitting on that stone throne every morning for 3 years, and today you sit like a man who has given up. The accuracy of her observation struck Stigvard like a physical blow. He rose from the throne, his massive frame unfolding with the fluid grace of a predator. Yet there was no menace in the movement, only the restless energy of a soul suddenly made aware of its own vulnerability. "You know nothing of what I carry." "Perhaps not," Gudrun conceded, shifting her satchel to her other shoulder. "But I know the weight of it is killing you as surely as any sword thrust." The giant took a step closer, close enough now that Gudrun had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. This near, she could see the fine scars that mapped his face like a history written in pale lines across weathered skin. One ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, while another crossed his forehead in a diagonal slash that spoke of an axe blow barely survived. But it was not the old wounds that concerned her. It was the fresh exhaustion that had settled in the depths of his eyes. "What would you have me do?" The question carried a note of genuine bewilderment, as though he had forgotten that choices beyond endurance existed. Gudrun reached into her satchel and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. With careful fingers, she unfolded the covering to reveal a pendant, carved from what appeared to be ordinary whalebone. Yet, as the morning light struck its surface, intricate patterns became visible, interwoven spirals that seemed to move and shift with each change of angle. At its center lay a small piece of amber, perfectly clear except for the tiny leaf preserved within its golden depths. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said, offering the pendant toward Stigvard. "She was a völva, a seer, and she taught me that some gifts can only be received when a heart is ready to open." Stigvard stared at the pendant, but made no move to accept it. "I want no magic, old woman. I've had my fill of prophecies and pronouncements." "This is not magic," Gudrun replied calmly. "This is simply a reminder that even the smallest leaf can survive when surrounded by protection." She pressed the pendant into his reluctant palm, her small fingers surprisingly warm against his cold skin. "My grandmother told me to give this to someone who had forgotten that survival is not the same as living." The pendant felt heavier than its size suggested, and Stigvard found himself unable to look away from the preserved leaf trapped within the amber. Something about its perfect stillness spoke to him in ways he could not name. "Why do you care what becomes of me?" Gudrun's expression softened, revealing glimpses of the woman who had once been young enough to dream of futures that stretched beyond the next harsh winter. "Because I know what it means to choose solitude as protection, and I know what it costs when that protection becomes a prison." She turned to continue on her path to Magnus's dwelling, but paused after a few steps. "My hearth fire burns warm tonight, giant. There will be venison stew and fresh bread, and stories older than either of us. The door is unbarred." As her footsteps crunched away through the snow, Stigvard remained motionless, the pendant warming gradually in his closed fist. The simple invitation had shattered something fundamental in his carefully constructed world, the assumption that his isolation was both deserved and permanent. For 3 winters he had sat on his stone throne, watching life unfold in the village below, while remaining safely apart from its complications. Now, with a few words and a small gift, an old woman had exposed the hollowness of that safety. He opened his palm and studied the pendant more closely. The leaf within the amber was perfectly preserved, every vein and curve as clear as the day it had been captured. Yet it was also utterly alone, suspended in golden stillness. That was both protection and prison. The parallel to his own existence struck him with uncomfortable clarity. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of silver and blue. From the village below came the familiar sounds of awakening life, children's laughter, the ring of hammer on anvil from the smithy, the lowing of cattle being led from winter shelters to drink at the partially frozen stream. Stigvard had listened to these sounds for countless mornings, finding in them a sense of connection that required no participation on his part. Today, however, they seemed to emphasize his separation rather than bridging it. He thought of Gudrun's words, "Come inside or die alone in the cold." The physical cold held no threat for him. His body had been hardened by years of northern winters, and his longhouse was warm enough to shelter a dozen souls in comfort. But there was another kind of cold that no fire could banish, a creeping numbness that had been spreading through his spirit like ice forming on still water. Perhaps it was time to acknowledge what every warrior learned eventually, that some battles could not be won through strength alone. The pendant seemed to pulse with warmth in his palm, though he knew this was likely imagination. Still, he found himself thinking of the old stories his mother had told him as a boy, tales of transformation and redemption that seemed as distant now as the southern lands, where his younger self had learned the true cost of glory. In those stories, salvation often came not through grand gestures or heroic deeds, but through small acts of courage, the decision to trust when trust seemed impossible, the choice to hope when hope appeared futile. Stigvard closed his fingers around the pendant and lifted his gaze to the village below. Somewhere among those familiar dwellings, Gudrun was going about her morning tasks, carrying medicines to the sick and comfort to the troubled. She had made her offer without conditions or expectations, asking nothing in return except that he consider the possibility that his story need not end in solitude. The stone throne behind him suddenly felt less like a place of peaceful contemplation and more like a monument to wasted years. How many mornings had he spent watching life unfold from this distance? How many opportunities for connection had he allowed to pass while he maintained his careful isolation? The questions carried weight he was not prepared to bear, yet he found himself unable to dismiss them. A raven landed on the armrest of his throne, regarding him with the bright intelligence that made these birds both revered and feared among his people. Ravens were Odin's messengers, carriers of wisdom and harbingers of change. This one studied him for a long moment, before releasing a single harsh cry that seemed to echo from the surrounding mountains. Then it spread its wings and flew toward the village, leaving Stigvard alone with his thoughts and the weight of an unexpected choice. The afternoon brought no relief from the weight of Gudrun's invitation. Stigvard found himself unable to settle into his usual routines, moving restlessly between his workbench and the great hearth that dominated the center of his longhouse. The familiar tasks that normally brought peace, sharpening weapons, mending harness leather, carving delicate figures from blocks of birch, felt hollow and meaningless. He tried to focus on the half-finished wolf he had been crafting for young Bjorn, the blacksmith's son, but his hands seemed unwilling to obey his intentions. The carving knife slipped, scoring a jagged line across the wolf's flank that ruined hours of careful work. Stigvard set the piece aside with a muttered curse, recognizing the futility of attempting precision when his thoughts scattered like leaves in a storm. The pendant lay on the table before him, catching firelight in the amber's depths. The preserved leaf seemed to mock his indecision. Here was something that had accepted its fate, finding a strange beauty in its golden prison. Yet Gudrun's grandmother had spoken of protection, not imprisonment. Perhaps the difference lay not in the circumstances, but in the choice to see possibility rather than limitation. As evening approached, the familiar sounds from the village below began to fade. Cooking fires sent thin streams of smoke into the darkening sky, and the warm glow of oil lamps began to appear in windows throughout Frostgard. Somewhere among those lights, Gudrun would be preparing her promised meal, perhaps wondering if her invitation would be accepted or dismissed like so many others before it. Stigvard stood and moved to the small bronze mirror that hung beside his sleeping alcove. The face that stared back at him belonged to a stranger, hollow-cheeked and gaunt despite his massive frame, with eyes that held the distant look of a man who had been watching life rather than living it. When had he become this spectre? When had the vital warrior who had once charged into battle with songs on his lips transformed into this cautious hermit who measured safety in the distance between himself and others? The answer came with uncomfortable clarity. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. The morning when the last of his shield brothers had departed for the southern trading routes, leaving him alone with his choice to remain in Frostgard rather than return to the wandering life that had once defined him. He had told himself it was wisdom, that a man past his 40th winter should seek stability rather than adventure. But wisdom and cowardice could wear remarkably similar faces, and Stigvard was no longer certain which had guided his decision. He moved to his sea chest, a massive piece hewn from oak and bound with iron that had travelled with him across half the known world. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled leather, lay the artifacts of his former life, a silver arm ring given by a grateful jarl after a successful raid, a silk scarf from Constantinople that still held the faint scent of eastern spices, a small wooden horse carved by his youngest shield brother during a long winter siege. Each item carried memories that he had thought safely buried beneath the routine of his solitary existence. His fingers closed around a small pouch near the bottom of the chest. The leather was soft with age and handling, and inside lay a handful of silver coins, payment for services that now seemed to belong to another man's life. More importantly, nestled among the coins was a ring of braided gold that had once belonged to Astrid Weavesdaughter, the only woman who had ever truly claimed his heart. Astrid had died of the wasting sickness during their second winter together, her bright spirit flickering out like a candle in a sudden wind. Stigvard had carried her ring for 15 years, through battles and travels, storm and calm, as a reminder of what love could be when two souls found perfect harmony. Her death had been the first crack in his armor. Everything since had simply widened the breach until he stood as he did now, intact but empty, strong but brittle. The ring caught the firelight as he turned it in his palm, and for a moment he could almost hear Astrid's laughter, feel the warmth of her hand in his as they planned a future that would never come to pass. She would not have approved of what he had become, this shadow man who honored her memory by refusing all chance of joy. Astrid had believed in hope the way others believed in the gods, absolutely and without question. She would have been the first to push him toward Gudrun's door, would have scolded him for allowing grief to transform into mere habit. A knock at his door startled him from his reverie. Stigvard frowned, glancing toward the entrance with surprise. Few visitors came to his dwelling uninvited, and never after dark. He rose slowly, his warrior's instincts automatically noting the weight of his axe where it rested against the wall within easy reach. "Who comes to my door with the darkness falling?" he called, his voice carrying easily through the heavy timber. "One who brings news from the village," came a young voice, high and uncertain. "Please, giant sir, my grandmother sent me." Stigvard unbarred the door and pulled it open to reveal Eirik, Gudrun's grandson, a boy of perhaps 12 winters who served as message runner for the village council. The child stood shivering in the doorway, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Behind him, snow had begun to fall again, large flakes that promised a heavy accumulation before dawn. "Come inside before you freeze," Stigvard said, stepping aside to let the boy enter. "What message does your grandmother send that could not wait for morning?" Eric's eyes widened as he took in the interior of the longhouse, the massive hearth with its carved stone surround, the walls hung with weapons and tools, the rich furs that covered floors and sleeping alcove. Few villagers had ever seen inside Stigvard's dwelling, and the boy's wonder was evident in his expression. "Grandmother says to tell you that Magnus the Ancient has passed to the halls of his fathers," Eirik said, his young voice solemn with the weight of his message. "She sits with the body now, preparing him for his journey. She says—" The boy paused, clearly reciting words he had been instructed to repeat exactly. "She says the living should not spend this night alone with their thoughts." The news struck Stigvard like a physical blow. Magnus had been 93 winters old, the keeper of countless stories, and the last living link to Frostgard's founding generation. His death marked the end of an era, the passing of knowledge and wisdom that could never be recovered. More personally, it reminded Stigvard of his own mortality and the finite nature of choices deferred. "Tell your grandmother I will come," he heard himself saying, the words emerging without conscious decision. "Tell her the giant accepts her invitation." Eric's eyes brightened at Stigvard's unexpected acceptance, though he tried to maintain the solemn dignity appropriate to his messenger role. "She will be pleased, giant sir. Grandmother has been cooking all day. Enough food for an army, father says." As the boy prepared to venture back into the thickening snowfall, Stigvard found himself reaching for his heavy winter cloak, a garment of wolf fur and thick wool that had served him through countless harsh seasons. The simple act of preparation felt strange after years of spending evenings alone with only the fire for company. "Wait," he called to Eric, moving to his workbench, where several completed wooden figures waited in neat rows. He selected a small bear carved from dark walnut, its surface polished to a warm sheen. "For your courage in traveling through the storm." Eric accepted the gift with reverence, turning the carved bear over in his small hands. "It's beautiful, giant sir." "Thank you." He tucked the figure safely inside his tunic. "Grandmother was right. You do have kind eyes when you're not trying to look fierce." The observation caught Stigvard off guard, and he found himself almost smiling as he secured his cloak and followed the boy out into the night. The snow fell steadily now, muffling sound and transforming the familiar landscape into something mysterious and dreamlike. Their footsteps crunched in rhythm as they made their way down the winding path toward the village proper. As they walked, Eric proved to be an unexpectedly companionable guide, chattering about village life with the unconscious ease of youth. "Old Magnus told the best stories," he said, his breath forming small clouds as he spoke. He remembered when the first longships came to these shores, when there was nothing here but forest and stone. He said his grandfather helped cut the first timber for the settlement. Stigvard listened with growing interest, realizing how much of the village's history he had remained ignorant of, despite his years of residence. In his self-imposed isolation, he had observed Frostgard's daily rhythms without truly understanding the deeper currents that shaped its community. Magnus's passing represented more than the loss of an old man. It was the severing of a living connection to the very founding of their small corner of the world. "Did he speak of the early winters?" Stigvard asked, surprised to find himself genuinely curious. "The first settlers must have faced challenges we can barely imagine." "Oh yes," Eirik nodded enthusiastically. "He said the second winter nearly killed them all. The supply ships from the south were delayed by storms, and they had to eat bark and roots to survive. But they held together, shared everything they had. Magnus said that's when they learned they were no longer just raiders or traders, but a real community." The boy's words carried weight beyond their simple telling. Stigvard understood the difference between surviving alone and surviving together. He had experienced both during his years of warfare and wandering. The strength that came from shared purpose and mutual support had once been as natural to him as breathing, yet somehow he had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the vulnerabilities that community demanded. They reached the village center as the snow began to intensify, transforming the familiar cluster of buildings into soft white shapes that seemed to glow with inner warmth. Smoke rose from every chimney, and the golden light that spilled from windows onto the snow created pools of welcome in the winter darkness. Stigvard realized with sudden clarity that he had not walked these paths at night for nearly 3 years, had not experienced the village as a place of shelter and fellowship, rather than simply a distant collection of lights viewed from his headland. Gudrun's cottage stood out among the others. Not for its size, it was actually smaller than most, but for the sense of purpose and order that surrounded it even in the storm. The herb garden beside her door lay dormant under snow, yet even the bare stalks seemed arranged with intention, promising renewal when spring returned. Warm light glowed through the oiled hide that covered her windows, and the scent of cooking food drifted from her chimney to mingle with the clean smell of falling snow. Eric knocked on the door with the familiarity of frequent welcome. "Grandmother, I've brought the giant as you asked." The door opened to reveal Gudrun herself, though in the golden lamplight she seemed somehow transformed from the stern figure who had confronted Stigvard that morning. Her silver hair was bound in a neat braid, and she wore a dress of deep blue wool that brought out the clarity of her winter sky eyes. More importantly, her expression held none of the challenging directness of their earlier encounter. Instead, she welcomed them with the warm practicality of a hostess receiving expected guests. "Come in, both of you, before you become snowmen in my doorway," she said, stepping aside to let them enter. "Eric, hang your cloak by the fire to dry, and tell your mother I've kept you fed so she needn't worry." The interior of Gudrun's cottage enveloped Stigvard like an embrace. The main room was smaller than his own great hall, yet it felt immeasurably more alive. A fire crackled cheerfully in the central hearth, its light dancing across walls hung with woven tapestries that told stories in thread and dye. The air carried the rich scents of venison stew, fresh bread, and the subtle perfume of the dried herbs that hung from every rafter. But it was the sense of presence that struck him most forcefully. This was a space shaped by human habitation, by the daily rhythms of life lived with purpose and connection. Every object, from the spinning wheel in the corner to the cooking pots suspended over the fire, spoke of function fulfilled and care applied. It was the opposite of his own dwelling, where functionality had gradually given way to mere existence. "Sit," Gudrun commanded, gesturing toward a bench positioned near the fire. "The stew needs a few more minutes, and we should speak of Magnus before the others arrive for the death watch." As Stigvard lowered his massive frame onto the offered seat, he noticed a wooden bowl waiting on the table beside the bench, carved from a single piece of ash, with intricate knotwork decorating its rim. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master carver, yet it was intended for everyday use rather than ceremony. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers along the smooth curves of the bowl's edge. Gudrun's expression softened with what might have been pride. "My late husband taught me the craft during the long winters of our early marriage. He said idle hands were the devil's workshop, but busy hands could create beauty from simple wood." She paused, studying Stigvard's face in the firelight. "Much like idle hearts, I suspect." The observation hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor invitation, simply truth spoken with the directness that seemed to characterize all of Gudrun's words. Stigvard found himself studying her face in the firelight, noting the fine lines that mapped a lifetime of expressions: laughter, sorrow, concentration, joy. This was a face that had lived fully, that bore its age like an earned honor, rather than a burden to be hidden. "Tell me of Magnus," he said, deflecting attention from himself, while genuinely seeking to understand what the village had lost. "I knew him only as a distant figure, always present but never truly encountered." Gudrun moved to the fire, stirring the contents of a large iron pot that hung suspended from a hook. The rich aroma of the stew intensified, filling the cottage with promises of warmth and sustenance. "Magnus was our memory keeper," she said, her voice carrying the weight of respect earned over decades. Not just stories and histories, but the reasons behind our customs, the wisdom that shaped our laws. When young couples sought his blessing for marriage, he would speak to them of the deeper bonds that survive beyond passion's first fire. She ladled stew into 2 bowls, the wooden one she had carved and another of similar craftsmanship. As she worked, her movements carried the unconscious grace of someone who had performed these simple tasks countless times, yet still found meaning in them. He often spoke of you, giant, wondered what manner of pain could drive a warrior of your reputation to choose exile among his own people. The words struck deeper than Stigvard had expected. He spoke of me, but I never. We rarely exchanged more than greetings in the market square. Magnus read people the way others read runes, Gudrun replied, settling onto a low stool across from him and offering one of the filled bowls. He said you carried yourself like a man who had lost something precious and blamed himself for the loss. He recognized the signs because he had worn them himself as a young man. Stigvard accepted the offered bowl, surprised by its warmth against his palms and the way the simple act of being served felt both foreign and deeply welcome. The stew was rich with herbs and tender meat, seasoned with care and attention to detail that spoke of cooking as an act of love rather than mere necessity. What had Magnus lost? He asked, finding himself genuinely curious about the old man whose death had created this unexpected opening in his carefully constructed isolation. Gudrun's expression grew thoughtful, and she reached toward a small shelf beside the hearth where several objects sat in careful arrangement. Her fingers closed around what appeared to be a simple piece of whalebone, carved into the shape of a raven in flight. Yet as she held it up to the firelight, intricate details became visible. Individual feathers rendered with breathtaking precision, eyes that seemed to hold intelligence and purpose. His first wife and their infant son, she said quietly, turning the carved raven over in her weathered hands. Lost to raiders during the early years, when our defenses were weak and hope was often in short supply, Magnus carved this the day after their funeral pyre burned down to ashes. He told me once that he needed something beautiful to remember them by, something that captured flight rather than death. The carving was extraordinary, clearly the work of someone who understood both the technical demands of the craft and the deeper emotional needs it could fulfill. Stigvard recognized in it the same impulse that drove his own woodworking, the desire to create meaning from loss, to transform grief into something that could be touched and held. He remarried later? Stigvard asked, though he knew the answer. Magnus had been husband to Helga the Wise for more than 50 years, their partnership legendary throughout the surrounding settlements. He did, though it took him 7 years to believe he deserved happiness again, Gudrun replied, setting the carved raven carefully back on its shelf. Helga was patient with his ghosts, wise enough to honor his first love without competing with memory. Their marriage became one of the great partnerships of our time, 2 souls who had both known loss-finding strength in shared understanding. The parallel to his own situation was not lost on Stigvard. He thought of Astrid's ring, still warm against his chest, where he wore it on a leather cord beneath his clothing. For 15 years, he had treated her memory like a sacred flame that could only be honored through solitude. Yet Magnus had found a way to carry love forward rather than simply preserving it in isolation. "You think me a fool for carrying my grief so long," he said, the words emerging without conscious intention. Gudrun's eyes met his with surprising gentleness. I think you a man who loved deeply, and fears to diminish that love by risking it again. But love is not a finite resource, giant. It grows stronger when shared, not weaker. Before Stigvard could respond, voices approached through the snowy night, the sound of other villagers arriving for the traditional death watch that would honor Magnus through his final night among the living. Gudrun rose to prepare for their arrival, but paused beside Stigvard's seat. The others will want to hear stories of Magnus tonight, she said. Share what you knew of him, even if it seems small. Sometimes the smallest memories carry the greatest truth. The cottage door opened to admit a stream of villagers, each carrying something to contribute to the communal vigil. Food, drink, instruments for music, or simply their presence. Stigvard recognized most of them by sight, though he had spoken with few beyond the basic courtesies required for market transactions. Bjorn the smith entered with his wife Ragnhild and their young son, the boy who would receive the carved wolf if Stigvard could repair the damage his earlier distraction had caused. Eric the shipwright came with his elderly mother, leaning heavily on his arm, while Thora the healer brought her bag of herbs and her reputation for easing both physical pain and spiritual suffering. As the cottage filled with quiet conversation and shared purpose, Stigvard found himself observing dynamics he had never taken the time to notice. These people knew each other with the intimacy of shared history, not merely as neighbors, but as a community that had weathered storms together and emerged stronger for the experience. Children moved easily between adults, secure in the knowledge that any hand extended toward them would offer protection rather than harm. Conversations flowed in the comfortable patterns of old friendship, with space left for silence when words seemed inadequate. Most remarkably, no one seemed surprised by Stigvard's presence. They offered greetings with the natural courtesy due to a neighbor, but without the awkwardness he had expected from people unaccustomed to his company. Perhaps his isolation had been more self-imposed than he had realized, maintained by his own assumptions rather than any actual rejection from the community. As the evening deepened, the cottage transformed into something more than a simple dwelling. It became a vessel for shared memory and communal grief. Stories began to flow as naturally as the mead that Bjorn had brought in a leather skin, each tale adding another facet to the complex portrait of the man they had lost. Eric the shipwright spoke first, his weathered hands gesturing as he described how Magnus had taught him to read the grain of wood, to understand which trees would yield the strongest planks for longship construction. He could touch a piece of timber and know its history, Eric said, his voice carrying the reverence of a master craftsman for his teacher. Not just where it had grown, but what storms it had weathered, what made it strong. The observation resonated with Stigvard more deeply than he had expected. How long since he had thought of his own storms as sources of strength rather than simply scars to be hidden. Magnus had possessed the wisdom to see potential where others saw only damage, a gift that Stigvard was beginning to suspect the old man had tried to extend to him as well. Ragnhild shared memories of Magnus helping with difficult births, his presence bringing calm to desperate situations through nothing more than his steady confidence that life would find a way. He delivered half the children in this room, she said, glancing around at the assembled faces. Always said that watching new souls enter the world reminded him why the struggles were worthwhile. As the stories continued, Stigvard found himself drawn into the rhythm of shared remembrance. When a natural pause occurred in the conversation, he surprised himself by speaking. I knew Magnus only slightly, he began, his deep voice causing conversations to quiet. But I saw him every market day for 3 years, and I never once saw him hurry. The observation seemed simple, yet it drew nods of recognition from around the room. Gudrun smiled encouragingly, sensing that more words waited beneath Stigvard's hesitant beginning. In my younger years, he continued, finding his way carefully through thoughts he had never before spoken aloud, I learned that most men move through the world as though chased by invisible wolves, always rushing toward the next goal, the next battle, the next achievement. But Magnus moved like a man who understood that presence was more valuable than progress. Thora the healer leaned forward, her intelligent eyes bright with interest. You observed him closely for someone who claimed no friendship with him. The gentle challenge carried no rebuke, only curiosity. Stigvard realized that his years of careful observation had created a knowledge of his neighbors that he had never acknowledged, even to himself. I suppose isolation sharpened certain kinds of sight, he admitted. When you stand apart from life, you notice details that participants might miss. And what details did you notice about the rest of us? Bjorn asked, his tone carrying the easy humor of a man comfortable in his own skin. Should we be worried about what the giant sees from his stone throne? Laughter rippled through the cottage, but it was gentle rather than mocking. Stigvard found himself almost smiling as he considered the question. I noticed that Ragnhild always checks the sky before hanging wash, that Eric's son carves ship models from driftwood while his father works, that Thora hums the same melody when she tends her healing herbs. He paused, realizing that these small observations represented a connection he had never consciously acknowledged. I noticed that you live your lives with attention and care, that you find meaning in daily tasks that could easily become mere routine. Gudrun reached toward another shelf and withdrew an object that caught the firelight, a small loom, no larger than a man's hand, carved from pale birch and strung with threads of different colors. The workmanship was exquisite, clearly the product of countless patient hours, yet it was sized for a child's hands. Magnus made this for my youngest granddaughter, she said, holding the tiny loom so the firelight played across its surface. She's only 4 winters old, barely able to hold the shuttle, yet he spent weeks crafting something that would grow with her skill. He said that teaching children to create beauty was the most important work any adult could undertake. The miniature loom represented everything that Stigvard had observed from his distant throne, the careful attention to small details, the investment in futures that the giver might not live to see, the transformation of raw materials into something that served both practical and spiritual needs. It was the opposite of the grand gestures and dramatic actions that had defined his younger years, yet somehow it seemed more substantial than any victory he had ever won in battle. I've been carving figures for the children, he found himself saying, the admission emerging before he could consider its implications. Small things. Wolves, bears, warriors. I leave them at doorways sometimes, but I never stayed to see if they were welcomed. Young Bjorn treasures the wolf you made him, Ragnhild said warmly. He carries it everywhere, tells stories about its adventures. He's been hoping to meet the mysterious giant who creates such wonderful toys. The knowledge that his small gifts had found appreciation created an unexpected warmth in Stigvard's chest. For years he had told himself that these carvings were merely ways to occupy his hands during the long winter evenings. Now he began to understand that they had been tentative gestures toward connection, messages sent from his isolation, in hopes that someone might receive them with understanding. Perhaps, he said slowly, I could teach the boy something of the carving craft, if his parents would permit it. Oh, he would be thrilled, Bjorn replied immediately. The lad has been pestering me to teach him, but my hands are better suited to hammer and tongs than delicate blade work." The offer felt significant in ways that Stigvard couldn't fully articulate. Teaching required trust, not just that the student would learn, but that the teacher had something valuable to share. It meant stepping beyond the safety of isolation to risk the vulnerabilities that all meaningful relationships demanded. As the night progressed, the cottage grew warmer, despite the storm raging outside. Stories continued to flow, each adding depth to their understanding of Magnus, and gradually to their understanding of each other. Stigvard found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, sharing observations and insights that he had accumulated during his solitary watches. When someone mentioned Magnus's skill at resolving disputes, Stigvard surprised himself by describing a conflict he had witnessed between two traders in the market square, how the old man had found common ground between their positions through patient listening rather than authoritative judgment. "You see clearly for one who claims to stand apart," Gudrun observed, her eyes meeting his across the fire's dancing light. "Perhaps the question is not whether you belong among us, but whether you're ready to believe you deserve to belong." The words hung in the warm air of Gudrun's cottage, like a challenge waiting to be accepted or denied. Around them, the gentle murmur of conversation continued as villagers shared memories and comfort in the traditional patterns of a death watch. Yet Stigvard felt as though he and Gudrun existed in a bubble of heightened awareness, where every word carried the weight of possibility. Before he could formulate a response, a sharp knock echoed through the cottage, not the gentle rap of expected visitors, but the urgent rhythm of someone bearing news that could not wait. All conversation ceased as Gudrun rose to answer the summons, her expression shifting from thoughtful contemplation to immediate alertness. The door opened to reveal Leif the Scout, one of the young men who regularly patrolled the approaches to Frostgard. Snow clung to his fur cloak, and his breath came in harsh gasps that spoke of hard running through difficult conditions. Behind him, barely visible through the swirling snow, stood two figures wrapped in travel cloaks, strangers whose presence at such an hour could only mean significant news. "Forgive the intrusion," Leif said, his eyes sweeping the assembled villagers before settling on Gudrun. "These travelers carry urgent word that concerns the giant." His gaze shifted to Stigvard, who had risen from his seat with the automatic alertness of a warrior recognizing potential threat. "They claim to bring word from your past, Stigvard Ironhand." The cottage fell into complete silence. Even the fire seemed to quiet its crackling as every person present turned their attention to the unfolding drama. Stigvard felt the familiar weight of his past settling over him like a heavy cloak, bringing with it the sharp awareness that moments of peace were often followed by demands for payment in currencies he thought he had finished spending. The first stranger stepped forward, pushing back the hood of his travel cloak to reveal features that struck Stigvard like a physical blow. Here was a face from his warrior years, older now, marked by additional scars and the silver of advancing age, but unmistakably Thorvald Grimson, his former shield brother, and the closest thing to family he had known since Astrid's death. "Stigvard," Thorvald said, his voice carrying the complex mixture of relief and urgency that comes with the completion of a long and difficult journey. "I had begun to fear we would never find you." The second figure remained hooded, but something in the set of their shoulders and the graceful way they moved suggested a woman. She stepped forward and extended her hand to reveal a small object that caught the firelight, a silver pendant in the shape of Thor's hammer, inscribed with runes that Stigvard recognized with a shock of disbelief. "This belonged to Astrid Weave's daughter," the woman said, her voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command. "I believe you knew her well." The pendant was indeed Astrid's, a piece she had worn every day of their time together, a gift from her father on her 16th birthday. Stigvard had watched it catch candlelight across countless evening meals, had felt its cool metal against his chest when she held him close. The impossibility of its presence, here, now, in the hands of a stranger, sent tremors of shock through his carefully constructed understanding of his own history. "Astrid died 15 years ago," he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of absolute knowledge. "I held her hand as she drew her last breath. I lit her funeral pyre with my own hands." The hooded woman reached up and drew back her hood, revealing features that struck Stigvard with the force of lightning. Here was Astrid's face, aged by 15 years but unmistakably hers, the high cheekbones, the intelligent green eyes, the small scar above her left eyebrow where she had fallen from a horse as a child. Yet this was not the face of someone returned from death, but of someone who had lived and aged in the normal way of mortal beings. "My name is Valdis," she said, her voice steady, despite the obvious impact her revelation was having on the assembled company. "I am Astrid's twin sister, and I have spent 15 years searching for the man she loved, above all others." The cottage erupted in gasps and murmured conversations as the implications of this revelation swept through the gathered villagers. Stigvard found himself unable to move, unable to breathe, as everything he thought he knew about his own history rearranged itself around this impossible truth. "Twin sister?" he managed, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. Astrid never spoke of a twin. Valdis's expression carried a mixture of pain and understanding. "Because I was dead to her, as she was dead to me. We were separated as children when our parents died. I was taken south by raiders while she was fostered here in the northern settlements. We each believed the other had perished until I learned of her death and began searching for word of her life." Thorvald stepped forward, his weathered face grave with the weight of difficult news. "Valdis sought me out 3 years ago, knowing of our friendship. She has been gathering information about Astrid's final years, trying to understand the woman her sister had become. But she discovered something else in her searching. Something that changes everything you believe about Astrid's death." The silence in the cottage became absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind around the eaves and the soft settling of logs in the fire. Stigvard felt as though he stood at the edge of a precipice, knowing that the next words would either destroy him completely or force him to rebuild his understanding of everything he had lost. Valdis reached into her travel pouch and withdrew a piece of vellum, carefully folded and preserved, despite the obvious signs of age and handling. "This is a letter Astrid wrote 3 days before she died," she said, offering the document to Stigvard with hands that trembled slightly. "It was found among the possessions of a traveling merchant who died this past winter. She intended for it to reach you, but circumstances prevented its delivery." Stigvard accepted the letter with hands that felt disconnected from his body. The vellum was soft with age, and he could see traces of Astrid's careful script through the translucent material. For 15 years, he had believed that their love story had ended with her final, labored breath. Now he held in his hands words that she had written in health, intended for his eyes alone. "What does it say?" Gudrun asked gently, speaking for the entire assembly. Stigvard's hands shook as he unfolded the letter, revealing lines of text written in the flowing script that had once been as familiar to him as his own reflection. The words swam before his eyes for a moment, before resolving into meanings that struck him like hammer blows against his heart. "She knew she was dying," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But she writes of hope, not despair. She speaks of—" He stopped, unable to continue, as the full import of Astrid's final message became clear. Valdis stepped closer, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "She writes of the child she carried, Stigvard, your child, a daughter who survived even though Astrid did not." The words hit Stigvard with the force of a war hammer to the chest. His daughter, alive. For 15 years he had mourned not only Astrid, but the future they would never share. The children who would never call him father. Now, in the warmth of Gudrun's cottage, surrounded by the gentle witnesses of a death watch, his entire understanding of his own life collapsed and reformed around this impossible truth. "A daughter," he whispered, the words strange and wonderful on his tongue. His massive hands trembled as he held Astrid's letter, the vellum suddenly feeling as precious as the finest gold. "Where is she? How? Who raised her?" Valdis exchanged a meaningful glance with Thorvald before answering. "Her name is Freydis. She was fostered by the abbey at Lindisfarne after Astrid's death. The midwives thought it best, given the circumstances. She knows nothing of her father, beyond what Astrid managed to tell the sisters before she died." "Lindisfarne," Stigvard repeated, his warrior's mind automatically calculating distances and travel times. The abbey lay 3 weeks' journey to the south, across waters that could be treacherous even in good weather. Yet it might as well have been across the Rainbow Bridge to Asgard, for all the connection it had held to his daily existence. "She's been so close all this time." Thorvald stepped forward, his expression carrying the gravity of unwelcome news. "There's more, old friend. The abbey is in danger. Viking raids have increased along the southern coasts, and there are rumors that a large force is planning an assault on the monasteries before winter deepens. The sisters have sent word requesting protection for their charges, but the local lords are too busy with their own defenses to spare men for a religious house." The tactical implications struck Stigvard immediately. Lindisfarne had always been a tempting target, wealthy in gold and silver, lightly defended, accessible from the sea. If raiders were indeed planning an assault, the abbey's inhabitants would have little hope of meaningful resistance. The sisters might be holy, but holiness offered poor protection against sharp steel and bloodthirsty men seeking easy profit. "When?" he asked, his voice carrying the flat tone that those who knew him recognized as a sign of dangerous focus. "The raids typically come with the full moon, when there's light for night sailing," Valdis replied. "That gives us perhaps 10 days before the danger becomes critical." Gudrun, who had remained silent during these revelations, moved closer to the fire and reached for an object that rested on the mantelpiece, a small wooden cross carved from dark oak and polished smooth by countless touches. It was clearly old, predating the more recent Christian influences that had begun to touch the northern settlements, yet it bore the unmistakable marks of skilled craftsmanship. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said, turning the cross over in her weathered hands. She was among the first in these lands to accept the new faith, though she never abandoned the old ways entirely. She used to say that any god worth worshipping would protect children, regardless of the names used in prayer. The observation carried weight beyond its simple religious implications. Freydis represented not just Stigvard's daughter, but innocence threatened by violence, hope endangered by greed, the same protective instincts that had once driven him to defend settlements and trade routes, now focused with laser intensity on a girl he had never seen, but who carried half his blood and all of Astrid's legacy. "You mean to go to her?" Gudrun said, though her tone suggested certainty rather than question. "I mean to bring her home," Stigvard replied, the words carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "But I cannot ask anyone else to risk their lives for my personal quest." "You're not asking," Thorvald said with a grin that reminded Stigvard of their younger years, when impossible odds had seemed more like interesting challenges than serious threats. "I've come this far to find you, brother. I'm not turning back now when the real adventure begins." Eric, who had been listening with the wide-eyed fascination of youth, suddenly spoke up. "Will you take the longship? Father says the Raven's Flight is the fastest vessel ever built in these waters." All eyes turned to Eric the shipwright, who had been quietly considering the logistics of the proposed expedition. His weathered face carried the thoughtful expression of a craftsman evaluating the requirements of a complex project. "The Raven's Flight could make the journey," he said slowly, "but she's built for speed and maneuverability, not for carrying a large warband. You could take perhaps a dozen men, no more, if you want to maintain the advantages of swift passage. A dozen men against however many raiders choose to assault the abbey." Valdis shook her head. "The odds are impossible." Stigvard found himself smiling for the first time in years, feeling the familiar stirring of tactical excitement that had once made him legendary among his peers. "The odds are perfect. Large forces move slowly and predictably. Small forces led by men who know their business can strike like lightning and vanish like smoke." Bjorn leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. "You speak like a man who has planned such raids before." "Planned them, executed them, survived them," Stigvard confirmed, "though never for stakes this personal." He turned to address the assembled villagers, his voice carrying the authority of command that had once rallied men to follow him into seemingly hopeless battles. "I ask nothing of any here. This is my burden, my choice, my risk. And mine," Thorvald added immediately. "And mine," Eric said quietly. "The Raven's Flight is my creation. I'll not see her sailed by anyone else on such a mission." One by one, the other men in the cottage voiced their commitment to the cause. Bjorn offered his skills as a warrior and metalworker. Leif volunteered his knowledge of coastal approaches and weather patterns. Even young Eirik, barely old enough to lift a sword, begged to be included in some capacity. "This is madness," Ragnhild said, though her tone carried pride rather than genuine protest. "You speak of sailing into certain danger for the sake of one child none of you have ever seen. One child who carries the blood of the man who defended our coast from raiders 3 years past," Bjorn replied firmly. "One child who is the daughter of the woman who died giving her life. Seems to me the debt is clear enough." Gudrun moved to a large chest that sat beneath her window, its iron hinges creaking as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in silk that had clearly seen better days, lay what appeared to be a mail shirt, fine chain links that caught the firelight and threw it back in patterns that suggested both beauty and deadly function. "This belonged to my late husband," she said, lifting the mail with careful reverence. "It was crafted by the finest smiths in the western settlements, blessed by both priest and Velva. He wore it through 20 successful campaigns and died peacefully in his bed at the age of 73. She offered the mail shirt to Stigvard, who accepted it with the appropriate gravity. The links were incredibly fine, more flexible than any armor he had worn in his younger years, yet clearly strong enough to turn aside the sharpest blade. The weight felt familiar in his hands, carrying memories of other preparations, for other battles that had seemed equally impossible. "Gudrun," he began, but she silenced him with a gesture. "A warrior going to save his daughter should wear armor, blessed by love as well as steel," she said firmly. "Besides, It has been gathering dust for 15 years. Better it should serve purpose again than remain a mere remembrance. As the night deepened, the cottage transformed into something resembling a war council, as the volunteers discussed routes, tactics, and supplies. Maps were sketched on pieces of bark, weapons were examined and evaluated, and plans were made with the careful attention to detail that separated successful expeditions from heroic disasters. Yet beneath the practical discussions ran a deeper current of recognition that this mission represented more than a rescue attempt. For Stigvard, it offered the chance to reclaim not just his daughter but his purpose, to step out of the isolation that had become his prison and back into the world of meaningful action. For the volunteers, it provided an opportunity to repay debts of honor and protection while proving themselves worthy of their community's trust. As dawn approached, and the death watch for Magnus drew to its traditional close, Stigvard found himself standing at another threshold, not just the physical departure for Lindisfarne, but the end of his self-imposed exile from life itself. The Raven's flight cut through the grey waters of the North Sea like a blade through silk, her sleek hull designed for speed over comfort. 8 days had passed since their departure from Frostgard, and the expedition had made better time than even Eric's optimistic predictions. The weather had held fair, the winds had remained favourable, and the ship's crew had settled into the rhythm of urgent but measured progress toward their distant goal. Stigvard stood at the vessel's prow, his massive frame braced against the ship's motion as he watched the coastline of Northumbria emerge from the morning mist. Behind him, 11 companions prepared weapons and checked equipment with the methodical efficiency of experienced warriors. The blessed mail shirt lay heavy across his shoulders, its weight both reassuring and sobering, a reminder of the community that had sent him forth and the responsibilities he carried. Valdis moved to stand beside him, her travel cloak whipping in the salt wind. During the voyage, she had proven herself an invaluable addition to their company, her knowledge of southern politics and recent raiding patterns filling crucial gaps in their tactical planning. More importantly, she had shared stories of Astrid's childhood that had helped Stigvard understand aspects of his lost love that he had never fully grasped. "The abbey lies just beyond that headland," she said, pointing toward a rocky promontory that jutted into the sea like an accusing finger. "If the raiders have come, we'll know soon enough." Thorvald joined them at the rail, his weathered face grave with the weight of command decisions. As the expedition's tactical leader, he had spent the voyage developing contingency plans for every scenario they might encounter. "Remember, if we're too late, if the abbey has already fallen, we don't throw away lives in futile gestures. We gather information, track the raiders, and plan a proper rescue." The words made tactical sense, but Stigvard knew that if they arrived to find Freydis dead or captured, no amount of strategic wisdom would prevent him from seeking immediate vengeance. 15 years of believing himself childless could not be erased in 8 days of sailing, but the knowledge of her existence had already transformed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. As the Raven's flight rounded the headland, the Abbey of Lindisfarne came into view, and with it the unmistakable signs of recent violence. Smoke still rose from several buildings, though whether from cooking fires or burning structures remained unclear. More ominously, 2 longships lay beached on the abbey's shore, their dragonhead prows turned toward the sea in preparation for swift departure. "Danes," Eric said grimly, recognizing the construction style of the foreign vessels. "And by the look of those ships, they carry crews of at least 20 men each." Stigvard felt the familiar tightening in his chest that preceded battle, the heightening of senses that transformed ordinary men into instruments of focused destruction. Yet this felt different from the conflicts of his youth, more personal, more desperate, carrying stakes that went beyond glory or profit to touch the very core of what made life worth living. "Take us closer," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had once rallied shield walls against overwhelming odds. "But stay beyond arrow range until we know what we face." The Raven's flight crept closer to shore, her crew using oars to maintain position while staying ready for rapid retreat, if necessary. Through the morning mist, details of the Abbey's condition became increasingly clear. Several buildings showed signs of fire damage, and bodies lay scattered in the courtyard, though whether they belonged to defenders or attackers remained impossible to determine from this distance. Most troubling of all, a crowd of figures could be seen gathered near the Abbey's main hall, too distant to identify individually, but clearly under guard by armed men. If the raiders had taken captives, rather than simply killing everyone they encountered, it suggested either unusual restraint or specific plans that might buy precious time. Leif, whose eyes were sharpest among their company, suddenly pointed toward the Abbey's bell tower. "There. Movement in the tower. Someone signaling." All eyes turned toward the stone structure that rose above the Abbey's other buildings. A small figure could indeed be seen in the tower's window, waving what appeared to be a piece of white cloth. The signals came in a pattern: 3 waves, pause, 2 waves, pause, repeated several times. "That's the Sisters' code," Valdis said, her voice tight with recognition. 3 and 2. It means danger but alive. Someone inside is trying to tell us the situation. Stigvard studied the distant figure with increasing intensity, his warrior's instincts cataloguing details that might prove crucial in the coming confrontation. The person in the tower moved with the quick energy of youth, and something in their gestures triggered a recognition that went beyond conscious analysis. "My daughter," he said, the words emerging as both statement and prayer. "That's Freydis in the tower." The knowledge transformed everything about their approach to the coming battle. This was no longer a rescue mission for unknown captives, but a father's quest to save the child he had never known existed. The 15 years of grief and isolation suddenly focused into a single point of absolute determination. The assault began at sunset, when the raiders' attention turned to their evening meal and the distribution of plunder. Stigvard had spent the day observing patterns of movement within the Abbey grounds, counting guards and identifying the strongest defensive positions. The Danish raiders had grown careless in their confidence, posting minimal sentries and allowing discipline to slacken as they celebrated their easy victory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Eric would bring the Raven's flight around to the Abbey's seaward side, creating noise and distraction while appearing to flee. This would draw the majority of the raiders toward their ships, convinced that potential reinforcements were retreating rather than attacking. Meanwhile, Stigvard and the main assault team would approach the Abbey from the landward side, moving through the marshy ground that the Danes had dismissed as impassable. As darkness fell, Stigvard found himself crouched in tall marsh grass, surrounded by men who had abandoned the safety of their homes to follow him into this desperate venture. Each carried weapons selected for close combat, axes, short swords, and seaxes that could kill efficiently in confined spaces. More importantly, each carried the determination of men fighting for something greater than themselves. The signal came as Eric's ship suddenly appeared around the headland, her crew shouting war cries and beating weapons against shields in apparent retreat. The ruse worked perfectly. Shouts arose from the Abbey as Danish warriors rushed toward the shore, convinced that they faced cowardly attackers who could be easily driven off or captured. "Now," Stigvard whispered, and 12 men rose from the marsh like vengeful spirits. The assault on the abbey's landward gate met no resistance. The few guards left behind fell to silent blade work before they could raise an alarm, their bodies hidden in shadows that concealed the true nature of the attack. Stigvard led his men through familiar patterns of movement, flowing like water around obstacles, striking like lightning when opportunity presented itself, vanishing like smoke when strength was met with greater strength. The first real fighting came in the abbey's courtyard, where Danish warriors finally recognized the true threat. Steel rang against steel as Stigvard's axe carved through enemy ranks with the practiced efficiency of a master craftsman. The blessed mailshirt turned aside blades that should have ended his charge, while his own weapon spoke with the voice of absolute commitment. Yet even as he fought, his eyes searched constantly for signs of his daughter. The white cloth had stopped signaling from the tower, suggesting either safety or capture. Each moment that passed without knowledge of her fate added urgency to movements that were already driven by desperate purpose. The breakthrough came when Thorvald led a flanking movement through the abbey's chapel, emerging behind the Danish line at precisely the moment when their formation began to waver under Stigvard's frontal assault. Caught between two forces and realizing that their easy victory had transformed into a deadly trap, the raiders began to break and run toward their ships. But their retreat was blocked. Eric had brought the Raven's flight close to shore, and her crew was already among the beached longships with axes and fire. The Danish vessels, their escape route cut off and their hulls breached, would carry no one to safety this night. The remaining combat was brief but vicious, as trapped men fought with the desperation of those who knew. Death waited regardless of their choices. When the last Danish warrior fell, silence descended over the abbey grounds, like a blessing from whatever gods watched over the righteous. Stigvard barely noticed the end of the fighting. His entire focus had shifted to the stone tower where he had seen the signals, where intuition told him his daughter waited. He took the tower steps 3 at a time, his massive frame somehow finding grace in urgency as he climbed toward whatever reunion awaited. The door at the tower's top stood slightly ajar. Through it came the sound of quiet weeping, not the grief of loss, but the relief of survival. Stigvard pushed the door open and stepped into a small chamber, lit by a single oil lamp. A young woman knelt beside the window, still holding the white cloth she had used for signaling. Her hair caught the lamplight in shades of gold that recalled Astrid's coloring, while her profile showed the strong bone structure that marked her as daughter to a warrior. When she turned toward the sound of his entrance, Stigvard looked into eyes that held all of Astrid's intelligence and strength, tempered by experiences that had taught her both courage and compassion. "Are you the ones who came to help?" she asked, her voice carrying the clear tones of educated speech. "I saw your ship. I hoped, but I didn't dare believe." "I am Stigvard," he said, his voice gentle despite the thunder of his heartbeat. "I believe I am your father." Freydis rose slowly, studying his scarred face with eyes that missed no detail. For a moment, neither spoke, as 15 years of separation compressed into a single shared breath. Then recognition dawned in her expression, not of his face, which she had never seen, but of some deeper knowledge that transcended sight. "Father," she whispered, and the word transformed everything Stigvard thought he knew about joy. The return voyage to Frostgard took 12 days, slowed by contrary winds and the need to make frequent stops while Freydis recovered from her ordeal. Yet for Stigvard, those days passed like moments stolen from eternity, precious beyond measure, as he slowly came to know the remarkable young woman who carried his blood and Astrid's spirit. Freydis proved to be everything he might have hoped for in a daughter, and more than he had dared imagine during his years of unknowing. At 15, she possessed a quick intelligence that reminded him strongly of her mother, tempered by a practical wisdom that spoke of hardships faced and overcome. The sisters at Lindisfarne had educated her well in letters and numbers, but life itself had taught her lessons in courage and resilience that no monastery could provide. She spoke easily of her childhood among the holy women, of lessons learned in herb lore and healing arts, of quiet hours spent copying manuscripts and tending gardens. Yet beneath the surface of this peaceful existence lay steel. She had organized the abbey's defense when the raiders came, had kept the sisters calm during the siege, had maintained hope when despair would have been easier. "I always knew I had a father somewhere," she told him, as they sat together during the voyage's 4th evening, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Mother Bridget said my mother spoke of you before she died. Said you were a warrior with a gentle heart who carved toys for children." The observation struck Stigvard with its accuracy. Through all his years of isolation, he had indeed continued creating small wooden figures, leaving them as anonymous gifts for village children. Now he understood that this impulse had been more than simple kindness. It had been practice for fatherhood, preparation for a role he had never expected to fulfill. Valdis, who had become something between aunt and older sister to Freydis during their journey, provided stories that filled gaps in family history none of them had known existed. She spoke of their mother's childhood, of the twins' separation, and the years of searching that had finally led to this reunion. More importantly, she helped Freydis understand the man her father had become, not just the warrior of reputation, but the craftsman who found peace in creation, and the protector who had chosen solitude rather than risk causing harm to others. When Frostgard's familiar coastline finally appeared through morning mist, Stigvard felt a combination of homecoming and new beginning that he had never experienced before. This return was different from all the others. He came not as a solitary warrior seeking temporary shelter, but as a father bringing his daughter home to the community that had supported their reunion. The village turned out in force to welcome them, drawn by news that had traveled faster than ships through the networks of trader and fishermen that connected coastal settlements. Gudrun stood at the water's edge, her silver hair catching sunlight and her winter sky eyes bright with satisfaction at seeing her judgment proved correct. Behind her, the people of Frostgard waited with the patient enthusiasm of those who understood that some stories required proper telling. Young Bjorn pushed through the crowd as soon as the Raven's flight touched shore, his eagerness to meet his promised carving teacher overcoming normal restraints of courtesy. "Is it true?" he asked Stigvard with the direct honesty of childhood. "Did you really fight 40 Danish warriors to save your daughter?" "Only 20, Stigvard replied with a gravitas that made the correction somehow more impressive than any boast. "And I had help from the finest companions a man could ask for." The celebration that followed lasted 3 days and established new traditions that would be remembered long after all the participants had passed to their final rest. Stories were told and retold, each adding details that transformed recent history into the stuff of legend. Yet for all the grand tales of battle and rescue, the moments that Stigvard treasured most were smaller and more personal. Watching Freydis help Gudrun prepare meals, seeing her delight in the wooden figures he had carved over the years, witnessing her easy acceptance into the community that had embraced both her and her father. On the final evening of celebration, as the village settled into comfortable exhaustion and winter preparations resumed their normal urgency, Stigvard found himself once again seated on his stone throne. But this time he was not alone. Freydis sat beside him on a smaller chair that Eric had crafted from driftwood, her throne, the shipwright had declared, suitable for a princess who had shown courage worthy of any warrior. The sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, reflecting off snow-covered mountains and the dark waters of the fjord. Below them, the village showed signs of the changes that 15 days could bring. New relationships forged in crisis, old bonds strengthened by shared purpose, the quiet satisfaction of a community that had discovered its own capacity for heroism. "Will you stay?" Freydis asked, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Or will the wandering call you again, now that duty is fulfilled?" Stigvard considered the question with the gravity it deserved. The warrior's life still held appeal. There would always be battles to fight, wrongs to right, adventures to pursue. But sitting here with his daughter, surrounded by people who had proven themselves worthy of trust and loyalty, he understood that some treasures were worth more than all the glory the world could offer. "I think," he said slowly, "that a man who has found his way home should be wise enough to remain there." Above them, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and in their light, the stone throne no longer seemed like a monument to isolation. Instead, it had become what Gudrun had always known it could be, a place where love conquered loneliness, where community triumphed over solitude, and where even the most guarded heart could learn to open once again.